All right, opening your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We're in chapter 2 now, working our way through this book. We have till March to finish it, so we'll get it. But we're going to start taking bigger chunks here as we start moving along because we have 12 chapters and about 20 weeks left to get through all the rest of this. So we will look at the first 11 verses this morning. Starting verse 1, Solomon says, I said in my heart, come now, and I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold of folly, till I might see what is good for the children of man to do under heaven during these few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the children of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. And also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. From my heart I found pleasure in all my toil, and this was the reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, striving after wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. All right, as we're going through the book of Ecclesiastes, we've been studying, again, this is about Solomon's perspective as an old man and what he is discovering after his old age. And what we're looking at in this section primarily is a section that he's looking at the world without God. He's being a practical atheist, per se. Now, I don't believe that Solomon ever lost his salvation. I don't believe he ever strayed away from God, that he never came back. I believe that he had a season of life, if you read the book of Kings, that he followed God, and then after a certain time in his life, then he was pulled away. We're going to talk about that here today a little bit. And during this season, this is when he tried to discover what life was all about. He wanted to see what was going on. And we looked at this book, and he opens this book up with the repetition of life and how vain it is. And again, that word vanity really doesn't mean what we think today the word vain is. It has an idea of it's there for a moment, has some pleasure, some aspect of joy, but it's gone and fleeting. It doesn't sustain you. It doesn't satisfy you. And that's the point of this book. He's trying to find a way to basically find satisfaction in life without God. And he's looking and writing all this down for our benefit so that we know and understand that God has a purpose in life, and God has given us some to desire, that is namely himself. And that's what he's going to conclude at the end of this book. But for right now, he's kind of going through these experiments. So last week we kind of looked at, okay, how is he going to reason himself to knowledge and joy? And he comes to the conclusion that gives him nothing at all. And he's trying to find meaning in life here. And last week we saw that wisdom and folly basically were the same. They didn't give any conclusions in life. He found no joy or satisfaction in life in this reasoning. And now what he's doing here in chapter 2, he's going to do an experiment. This is kind of call this the American dream experiment. How much joy and satisfaction can I find in the things of this world? Verse 1, that's how he opens this up. And this experiment that he does, and he says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this also is vanity. He kind of says, okay, I can't find the reason of life in my own wisdom, in my own intellect. I can't find reason or joy in madness. Let's try to find entertainment, satisfaction, temporal things on this earth to give me joy and satisfaction, pleasures of this world. And that's what he's saying. He literally says, in verse 1, it says, I said to my heart, literally saying, okay, he's kind of talking to himself here, kind of an awkward situation. But that's what he's doing in the writing. He says, I'm going to test myself with pleasure and joy. But he already tells us what the conclusion is before he gets through the experiment. He calls this vanity. It's there for a moment and then it's gone. It's fleeting. It doesn't give you any joy in life. And so that's what he's doing here. He's really doing that to be able to ascertain what's going on in this world and be able to find joy in that. And these joys are fleeting, as he says in the beginning. Now, just a little bit of a side. Typically what we see here in Scripture is that we find that, basically what Solomon does is something different than the rest of the biblical writers do. What happens is a lot of biblical writers, what they do is they will say, okay, here's the world, or here's this, and here's Christ, or here's God, and they decide between the two. Paul does this a lot in his writings. Paul says to live as Christ and to die as gain. And he compares to all his religious experiences and his pedigree as a Jew, and he calls it rubbish. And there's always this compare and contrast. Moses does this in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, basically, if you obey God, I will bless you, and if you disobey God, I'll curse you. We see that type of writing in there as well. John does this in his epistles. He writes about basically being of the world, and you can't be of the world, a friend of the world, and be a friend of God. There's these compare and contrast. Well, Solomon's not doing that. He's not saying, here's God and here's the world. He's just basically saying, there is no God, and I'm going to try to find joy in the world. That's what he's doing in this little experiment. It's a little different than what we see in the rest of the writing Scripture. There's no two options. He's just saying, I'm going to go all out, full force, with everything I have in this life to be able to discover if there's any joy and satisfaction in this world. And I think it's really important that Solomon does this, because I think a lot of people think this way in this world. Again, we discover there's two really people that he's addressing. One being the atheist, or the person that is without God, and them trying to find joy and satisfaction in life without God. That's the first audience. But the second one is basically for us believers, is sometimes we act that way. Sometimes we think that Christ doesn't suffice in our life, that God is not enough. Therefore, we try to find joy and satisfaction outside of God. Still holding on to our belief of Christ and his salvation, but then trying to practically live that it will not suffice, and try to find joy outside of Christ. And that's what he's doing here. He's basically having a worldview that is without God here at the beginning of this book. So you have to understand that. And the reason we do that is because if you don't understand that when you read this, you're going to think, wait a second, is this something that is prescribed to us as believers? The answer is no. And again, this is a biblical worldview. And I love, if you ever read books on worldview, one of the better ones is The God Who is There by Francis Schaeffer. He said this about worldviews. He says, every worldview that is not a biblical worldview is hopeless and without meaning. Kind of the same thing that Solomon's saying here, right? So he's basically saying, I'm going to have a worldview without a biblical construct. Remove Scripture, remove God, and I'm going to have joy and pleasure and see if that sustains me. This is a selfish pursuit that he goes after. He's not doing it saying, well, I'm going to do this so that I could teach others. If you look through these texts, you notice the emphasis on himself over and over. In verse 1, he says, I will test. In verse 3, he says, cherish my body, or cheer my body. Verse 4, I made, I build. Verse 6, I made. Verse 7, I bought. Verse 8, I gathered, I got. Verse 9, I became great. And then 10, kind of the crescendo, he says, whatever my eyes desire, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. So this is not a thing where Solomon said, I'm going to do this experiment so that I could teach everyone else what not to do. Or maybe I'm going to think about this and try this so that I could teach others. He does that after the fact. Again, this is the book of Ecclesiastes is a reflective proverb, or a reflective wisdom. It's looking back on the mistakes that he made and reflecting upon those mistakes. But he didn't do it from a pure source. He's just basically saying, I want to do this myself. Why? Because he wanted to find joy that was not fleeting. It wasn't vain. So as we go through some of these, just to let you know, some of these things are not sinful that he does. And that's kind of the confusion that could arise. Well, wait a second, Solomon, some of these things you're doing are not necessarily sinful, are they? Well, he doesn't say that. He just points to the fact that they are fleeting, they're vain. Now, some of the things he's going to point out, yes, and we're going to discuss those as well, are sinful aspects that he tried to embark in to find joy in life. But for some of these are not. In fact, he's going to show us during this book that some of the things that he's going to say that are vanity, he's going to turn around, put God in perspective, and say, okay, with God being the one who's glorified and God who's given you these things you can actually enjoy. So we have to understand that this is not in conflict with the rest of the book. Because as we go through, you're like, wait a second. Here he's saying this is vanity, and then we're going to get in chapter 3, and he says this is good. What's the difference here? Well, the difference is this. He's doing this in chapter 2 is really his embark without God. God is not in the picture at all. This is pure endeavor to find joy outside of God. So as we look at this, there's some things that are permissible and some things are not. We're going to look at each one of them. So that in verse 2, he has a selfish pursuit of entertainment. Let's look at that. He said this, I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use of it? He's using words that describe enjoyment in life, festivals, parties, things like that. Now, as you read the Old Testament, there are events, festivals in the Old Testament that God specifically commands the Israelites to enjoy it. One of those is Sukkot, or the tabernacles of Booths, where they would actually build a three-sided kind of a little hut outside of their home, and they would live in that, and to remind them of the difficulties of the journey of the 40 years in the wilderness, and as they would live in there. But yet now they're in the promised land, and now they're rejoicing. I happened to be in Israel during Sukkot and during that, and it's a fun time. It's a festival. It's fun. People are doing fun things. They're going around enjoying life. It's not a somber, gloomy type of event. It's not that God is a cosmic killjoy, as some people think he might be, or he just doesn't want us to ever have fun. He's actually commanding the Israelites to have fun and have festivals and feasts. But here Solomon takes it up a notch. He doesn't go to, okay, we'll have it when God prescribes us to do it and enjoy it during this time. He wants to do this perpetually, ongoing. This is an ongoing party, and guess what? He has the ability to do so. Solomon says that he wanted laughter and pleasure, and that meant hiring comedians and merrymakers and musicians and people. And just to give you an idea, when Solomon goes through all these things, he is the smartest person who's ever lived. He's the wealthiest person who has ever lived. And he's the most powerful person. Nobody could tell him no. So he could do this experiment in such a way that no person could ever repeat it. And his parties were, large in comparison. Listen to this in 1 Kings 4:22 through 23, talking about the provisions that he would have for one of these events. It says, Solomon's provisions for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 12 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. Some scholars estimate that one day provision could feed between 30 and 40,000 people. This was daily, Solomon's ability to do so, to be able to have these type of events, to feed that many people. It gives us some insight that he had a lot of people and a lot of parties, and he wanted to have fun and enjoy life and just have that thrill be constant and constant and constant. What has he described? It's madness. Why? Because once you throw one party and the party's over and the joy of the party's gone, again, it's vanity, it's fleeting, it's there for a moment, he has to come back and do another one and another one and another one. Well, he is a very wealthy man, but this is very rich expenditures, and this is very difficult for someone to sustain a lifestyle just enjoying life perpetually. I mean, that's not what God created us to do. We actually have it upside down here in American society. We believe that work is bad and pleasure is good, or enjoyment and entertainment. And So we do everything at all costs to keep us having entertainment the primary time and resource of our life, and work to be the least. Well, that's not how God created us. We are created in the image of God, right? And God actually worked what? He worked 6 days and rested on the seventh from creation. That was the model by which he did it. Well, he didn't rest because he was tired or exhausted from creating the world. I mean, that's not what... That his creative powers were never, ever even remotely tapped, because he's all powerful. But he did that to model to us that our lives should be based upon work first and enjoyment as a result. And Solomon's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about the result of hard work is enjoyment of those things that we receive, the things that we get out of our toil, the work of our hands, the satisfaction of work. But we live in a society that's completely opposite. We don't want to work, and we want to be entertained all the time. That's what Solomon's doing here. We don't want to. He doesn't want to labor. He just wants to have a party all the time. And he says this is madness. He doesn't find joy or satisfaction in it. And it's the same with us as well. Our lives would not find joy and satisfaction in constant entertainment. We're not designed that way. Nor does Solomon want us to be that way. But he does this because he can, and he's going to show us to the hilt what is capable of us to be able to do. And he says it's madness and it's folly and it's vain. So that's his first experiment. So he stops there and he goes in verse 3, and he has a pursuit of wine. Verse 3 says this, I have searched my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom. Again, that word heart is not your emotions, it's volition, it's your will in the Hebrew mindset. And how to lay hold of folly, till I might see what is good for the children of men to do under heaven during the few days of his life. Basically, Solomon says this, okay, entertainment didn't work, let's get out the wine, and I'm going to consume enough wine that I still have my intellect a part of me, and to see if I could get to the state of kind of intoxicated so that I could be able to reason and find satisfaction in life. And that's what he's basically doing here. He's drinking before he loses his mind, and that he might find meaning in life. And part of the reason is to remove the pain of life. It talks about that in Proverbs chapter 3, that wine is a way to remove the pain of life. And so what's going on here is that he wants to find meaning and deaden his emotions. And I can almost see Solomon doing this. Okay, today I'm going to drink this much wine, and we'll see what happens. And try to keep my intellect with me. And kind of pushing that limit and going further and further and further till he goes too far. He goes, okay, wait, we went too far. Let's go back and have it literally someone with him analyzing whether or not he's sane or not, or is he drunk. That's what he's basically doing. He's basically saying, I'm going to go as far as I can and not get drunk, but if I go too far, then we're going to pull this thing back a little bit and try to figure out what life means. And that's what he's doing here. And he basically says it's folly. I mean, he can't do it. It doesn't happen. He's basically saying, I could drink as much as I want and try to figure out life and maybe get to a place I understand it, but he never really arrives there. And that's the whole point of this. That he's trying to figure out what his joy is in life. Then in verses 4 through 6, he changes gears again. He has a pursuit of projects. I like how he says this. I made great works. And man, he'd made some amazing works for his age. He says, I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of the growing trees. So what he does now, he says, okay, now I'm going to focus my attention on building projects. I mean, that's typically what kings do, is they build things. They want to have some kind of monument left behind to commemorate their legacy. You see this in Egypt, where you have the pyramids and the obelisks and those things. Those things are all built, why? To commemorate the pharaohs. This is very common. People build things so that they can be remembered after they died of the great works they have done. So Solomon says, hey, I have all these resources. Let me start building. So that's what he does. I mean, this is very similar to our culture today, where people basically want to have nice things or have a nice home, and they want to build stuff. And, we live in America where that's possible. Again, we're going to see there's nothing wrong in this, but the focus can be incorrect. If you don't believe me, if you see it, a lot of people that are so consumed with their home, those do-it-yourself channels where they're flipping homes and everything, they're kind of cool to watch and see what they could do with a house and everything, but all their hope is built on this, taking this junky home and build it into their dream home, and that's all their hope and joy is found in it. Maybe it's enjoyable when they first walk through that door, but I guarantee after a while, if you're a homeowner, homes break down. Homes need constant repairs. It's a perpetual cycle of repairing and replacing. They don't give us joy, but this is what Solomon does. Listen to what some of his projects he's doing, why he's doing it. 1 Kings 7, 1-12 says this. Solomon was building his own house 13 years. It took him 13 years to build his home. And he had finished his entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. The length was 100 cubits, and his breadth was 50 cubits, and its height was 30 cubits, so about 18 inches a cubit. Imagine the ceiling of this place. 30 cubits high. That's tall. And it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars, which was extremely expensive, and cedar does not grow there in Israel. They had to import that from the Lebanese region. The archaeologists believe that they would basically cut down these large cedar trees. They would take it to the Mediterranean Sea. They would lash it all together. They'd take boats and float it all the way down to Israel. And then you have to remember, Jerusalem is not at sea level. It's about 2,800 feet up. Now we're thinking that's not that high, but back then, imagine taking whole pieces of lumber, uncut, and dragging them up from the sea level all the way up to Jerusalem. And it's not just, and going to Jerusalem is not like this. So like, here's the Med, and you just go up and, there's Jerusalem. It's not like a nice little incline. It's actually like this. And then you get to Jerusalem. So they have to go up and down all these little hills and valleys and get to Jerusalem. It's a lot of work. But guess what? Doesn't matter. Solomon has money. He goes on and talks about this place where, and it was verse 3, and it was covered with cedar from the chambers on where the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were windows framed in 3 rows, and a window opposite a window into 3 tiers. And on the doorways and the doors had square frames, and the window had an opposite window in 3 tiers. And he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its breadth was 30 cubits. And there was a porch with pillars and a canopy in front of them. And he made a hall of the throne where he would pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from the floor to the rafters. His own house, where he was to dwell in the other court back of the hall, was like that of workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for the Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. And all these were made of costly stones, cutting according to measure, sawed with saws back and forth, even from the foundation to the coping, and from the outside to the great court. The foundation was costly stones, huge stones that weighed 8 to 10 cubits. And they were costly stones according to the measurement of the cedars. The great court had 3 courses of cut stones all around them, and a course of beam cedars. And so he had in the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibules of the house. You guys are like, well, so what's the big deal? Like cutting stone, what's the big deal? To cut stone back then was a very laborious task. They didn't have jackhammers. They didn't have mason saws. Back then, most homes were built with what they called just stones lying around, and they would cut them almost like a Tetris, kind of put them all together and use mortar to keep the walls together. What basically the writer of 1 Kings is saying, Solomon went out, hired masons, and they cut perfectly cut stones to build his house. That's extremely expensive. Then he lined the walls with cedar and built poles with cedar. Now, cedar, I'm sure that smelled very good inside. If you ever been inside a cedar-lined closet, it smells wonderful. But can you imagine an entire house? So he has this forest of Lebanon, which is kind of like, think of it just a huge chamber with pillars holding this thing up. And then he has a place where his throne is. And it just was absolutely gorgeous. And then 1 Kings 1:9 talks about him finishing the house of the Lord. And that was a 20-year project. And I don't have time. I wish if you just read it, what the house of the Lord looked like. Everything was lined with gold, beautiful tapestries. It was to the hilt. I mean, the temple was absolutely beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. As you see, everything was lined with gold. And you see later on that they had the 30 gold shields that lined the inside of it that were later taken away by foreign countries. In 1 Kings 10:17, he basically finished the house of the forest of Lebanon. He built Pharaoh's wives. In 2 Chronicles 8, he began building cities. Hazar, Gezer, and Hebron, where he built these fortified cities. He built gardens and large pools to irrigate them. One pool was about 50 feet long and 50 feet deep. And they didn't have caterpillar backhoes to go dig it out. It's all done by hand. In Solomon's throne in 1 Kings, let me read just his throne. Turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 10. Starting just verse 18 through 20. And it says, the king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, and at the back of the throne was a calf's head. On each side of the seat were armrests and 2 lions standing beside the armrests. While the 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the steps of the 6 steps, the like of it was never made in any kingdom. I mean, imagine this throne going up 6 steps and the king sitting up on high and everything overlaid in gold. One Jewish source said that this throne was the most wonderful throne ever sat upon. It talked about it set with sapphires and rubies and emeralds and other precious stones with most brilliant and dazzling and fascinating hues and colors. And that's why when the Queen of Sheba came and saw the majesty of his home and his wealth, she was awestruck. She was awestruck. She's like, I've never seen such wealth in my entire life. And this was Solomon. And he made for himself and made him. So there's a couple artist renditions I have up here of that. So this will be during the time of Solomon. This is one artist rendition. I like this one, not so much for the temple area, which is at the very top, as you see there. But if you look down here towards the bottom, this is what I want you to focus on. That's the Kidron Valley down here. You can kind of see these little tributaries down here. You're thinking, okay, what's going on here? Well, back then, they didn't really have a natural source of water. In fact, the only source of water for Jerusalem is the Gihon Springs. So guess what Solomon did? He wanted all these gardens down here. And you don't have pumps, you don't have pipes back then. So guess what he did? The archaeologists have found that he basically cut ditches into the city. Then when he was done cutting these ditches, he would lay big flagstones over the top of these ditches, and the water would run under the city to irrigate his gardens year round. I mean, it was pretty impressive in the way of architecture back then. And it wasn't easy to do so. That's limestone. It's hard. Imagine cutting that by hand with a hammer and a chisel. That's your job all day. Yes, I got down 2 inches today. Here's another one. This is from the ESV Study Bible. As you can see, you got the gardens down there. If you can see right here, that's where David's home was. That was the palace during David's time. You can see how David was up on a hill and looking down into the city where the lady was basically bathing. But I want to focus on the top. Up there is where they kind of build a picture of Solomon's palace and the forest of Lebanon and the Pharaoh's and the Pharaoh's daughter's home and all that. And the very top, it's kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see where the temple is. That's kind of the artist's rendition based upon the cubits, how big Solomon's palace was in compared to the temple. Now, the temple was nice, don't get me wrong, but Solomon's palace was huge and amazing. That's what he built. Here's something that I don't know if you can really see. There's a gentleman way in the back, and there's a gentleman here. They're at both ends, about 40 feet apart, of one of the stones they cut to build that platform where Solomon built the temple. So to kind of give you an idea, they have no idea how they did this, or how Solomon did it. They estimate it weighs over, I think it's 540 tons, this one piece. So, to give you an example, as you look at those pictures, the top of the hill is like this. Well, this is where God said, I want a place where you're going to go worship me. Jewish tradition says it's Mount Moriah, the same place where Isaac was sacrificed, or was to be sacrificed by Abraham. This is the same location by Jewish tradition. It actually kind of fits really well with the Jewish tradition, and then where Abraham went from Hebron up to Jerusalem, and there's a lot of centrality of this area. But the problem is you can't build a big, huge thing on top of this hill. Why? Because it's very pointed at the top. In fact, you go there today, go under the Dome of the Rock, you can see the very pinnacle of this. So guess what Solomon did? He says, well, we can't make this work. We can't fit the temple up there as big as it needs to be, plus my palace. So guess what they did? They started putting blocks, all these blocks on both sides. Then they built a platform and they just fill this in, and now you have the top of it, which you see today is a Temple Mount. And actually, Herod expanded the Temple Mount, made it even bigger. So these are some of the stones that he cut. These are the costly stones. 540 tons in size. I mean, it's astronomically big. But he cut those things. This is actually, if you would go out this way, you would see the western wall. There's a tour that you could take underneath it so that you can see this one. All of these are Herodian cut, but there's one back here that you could tell that it's just not of that age. It's of Solomonic age. I don't know the exact dimensions. I know it's 40 feet long, and it's probably about 20 feet high. I mean, and they don't know how far back it goes. It's big. But they know it's cut, and it was moved.
Is that the actual stone from the temple as you can see it today, that picture?
Yeah, you can take the tour. It's underground. Mm-hmm. So the city's above you. So,
so a lot of it's been excavated?
Yes. Yeah, a lot of it's excavated. They keep on finding new things under there. You have to remember, there's been a lot of destruction in the Temple Mount area. Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed the entire Jerusalem area. And then after Herod rebuilt it, there was a destruction by the Romans. So there's been a lot of destruction. So, I mean, if they were able to and really kind of clean things up and dig down, they could probably find all kinds of fun stuff. But what they did back then was that they took the refuge material, the broken material, they used that to fill in the gaps. So back then they didn't care. They just said, hey, there's a bunch of stuff. Let's throw it in this pit to fill it up, and then they'll put good stones on top. That's kind of how they didn't really want to preserve. They didn't think, hey, let's preserve this. So, but this is a little bit to the, let's see, that would be the north side of the western wall. Here's an artist's rendition of Solomon's temple. As you can see, the entire thing was laid in gold. They believe that the cherubim were these huge angelic beings up there at the very top that made the Ark of the Covenant look tiny in comparison. This Solomon made this base. I mean, you can kind of see by the size of the individuals how big this was. I mean, this was just. But he built all this. This is kind of his point. I made for myself that it did all these things, and I did these things for. Obviously, he built the temple, but he did a lot of building for himself. And what does he say about it? It's vanity. It's vain. It's there for a moment. Verses 7 and 8 back in Ecclesiastes. He said this, I bought male and female slaves. I had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who have been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered myself silver and gold and the treasures of the kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women. During this time, the mark of someone's wealth was not a checkbook or a portfolio or bank account. And those things really did not exist. The way you could tell someone was rich was by what they had. There wasn't credit back then, so you couldn't borrow. So it wasn't like today where, people live in really nice houses, drive nice cars, have nice stuff, do nice things, and they're maxed their credit cards to the hilt and they're in massive debt. You don't really know back then that didn't exist. So this is the aspect of it where he said basically he had slaves and flocks. Now it's rich to be able to buy some of these, but think about the monetary amount of money that you need to be able to sustain all these things. Slaves have to be fed. They have to be housed. Flocks have to be fed. They have to be housed. There was a mass amount of monetary acquisition that he had to be able to do this. And then servants to tend those flocks. And he was wealthy. I mean, I'll be honest, he makes the richest person or the 10 richest people together in America look poor. I mean, just being honest, or worldwide. That's how much wealth he had. 1 Kings 10 talks about this, about his wealth. And Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. That's a lot of expense. And he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen whom he stationed at the chariot cities. Those are the 3 cities I mentioned that he built, and with the king of Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as sycamore in the Shephelah. That means a lot. I mean, basically, silver is worthless. That's how much silver he had. And Solomon's import of horses from Egypt in Q, and the king's traders received from them the Q at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. I mean, this was just money upon money upon money. It was just nothing. I mean, the silver was like the stones in Israel and Jerusalem. If you ever go there, it's a really rocky place. There's stones everywhere. Here he did whatever he wanted. He had all the power in the world, and what he comes to the conclusion of. This is all vanity. Pursuit of money is vain. Verse 8b talks about a pursuit of extramarital relationships. And he says, and many concubines, the delight of the children of man. Now, we talked about his wives. We're going to look at that here in a second when it talks about 1 Kings. But he also had concubines. So the wives, to separate the two, the wives were primarily married women that he married for the purpose of treaties with other countries. That was the main purpose and goal behind that. So he would marry the princesses of various foreign countries in these treaties, and he would keep them, and then they would procreate and have children, thus preventing attacks on the country. That was the whole purpose. But the concubines were purely for pleasure for him. That's the point of the passage here. It refers to the delight of the children of man. Actually, literally in the Hebrew, it says every man's dream, or many concubines. It actually, those word concubines means a harem of beautiful women. And that's what he was after. He had these women. In 1 Kings 11, 1 through 4 says this, now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Among the daughter of the Pharaoh, the Moabite, the Amorite, the Edomite, the Sidonian, the Hittite woman, from the nations concerning which the Lord has said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And that was the issue. He basically, he just didn't do it. He just didn't engage with these women for the treaties. He's basically said he clung to them in love. He had 300 wives and princesses. Those are the treaty. And then 300 women as part of his concubine. And the problem is and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. This is what he did. He basically engaged in extramarital relationships. And he said, maybe if I get enough women, I'll find joy in life. And he never did. He never did. Again, a lot of people say, okay, there's polygamy in the Old Testament. Why was there polygamy in the Old Testament? Again, when you read Old Testament narrative, when you're studying the Old Testament narrative, remember there's two different ways of looking at it. What is being prescribed, basically telling us what we should be doing, or describe what is going on. What we have here, and also we see all the patriarchs, is description. They had multiple wives. They're just describing what they were doing. Why? They were embracing the culture at that time, and thus violating God's law, especially for the king. The king was only told to have one wife. We see David violate that. Solomon violated that. Every time a polygamous relationship was mentioned, there's always mass problems. Always. It was a mess. God basically designed it to be one man and one woman for life. I mean, that was the purpose, and that's what he did from the garden forward. And unfortunately, man has decided not to listen to God's word. And that Solomon was part of that. In Hebrews 13, verse 4, it says, "Let marriage be held in high honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." And that was always from the beginning, from the garden till now. It's just one woman, one man for life and marriage, till death do them part. On a footnote of that, just a side note, there's some younger individuals in here. You notice that Solomon's choice had him stray from God. Your choice in who you marry has a massive influence on your future. A massive influence when you get in that relationship. So just remember that when whomever you choose to marry, what are they going to point you to? Are they going to point you to Christ or to other things? All right. So just kind of summarizing everything in verse 9 and 10, he basically summarizes his experiment. He basically says this: "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem." Basically says, I did it to the hilt, the best, the highest. "Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil." And so basically what Solomon's doing here is he's justifying what he said he was going to do. He's basically saying, I deserve it. I'm the king. I have enough. I could do this. I deserve it. Garrett in his commentary said this, Solomon felt that he had earned the right to enjoy himself. He had worked hard for all of this, but the payoff did not match the effort expended. Imagine the expense, the amount of labor, 13 years to build his own home. Years of doing this over and over again. And he was hoping that the return would be greater than the effort put into it, but it was actually the reverse. So Solomon's basically saying in verse 9 and 10, during this time, again, remember, during this time, I deserve it. Now, how many times have you heard that before? How many times have we done it in our own lives? I've worked hard. I deserve to get this. I want this. Now, again, there's nothing wrong. We're going to look at this. God's going to give us things to enjoy in this life, and we're going to see how to do it in a proper perspective. But what Solomon's doing this, again, he's doing this without God. He's acting as if God doesn't exist, and he's pursuing these things on his own. So you have to remember those perspectives as we go through this book. And then in verse 11, he discusses this a little further. He says, "Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil that I expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun." Solomon does the greatest experiment for the greatest entertainment, the greatest enjoyment that man could humanly embark in with no reservation, with no restrictions. And his conclusion is it's vanity and striving after the wind, and there's nothing to be gained under the sun. That's why when we look at our society and people continually pursue the things of this world over and over and over and over again, and trying to find joy in the world, they always come back futile, pointless. They have to do it again, right? And again, and again, and again. Because it doesn't satisfy, it doesn't fill you. That's what Solomon's telling us. And Solomon's basically saying, if you try to find your hope in these things, then you're going to fall short. Why? Because he did it. And he did it bigger and better than anyone could do it. So the funny thing is Solomon tells us not to do this, yet so many times in our own personal lives we try to do this. And then so many times we walk away going, man, that was good, but... I mean, earlier when we started this, I used the example of you going to the best steakhouse you could ever imagine. And you go in and you order that steak, and the chef prepares it perfectly, and you eat that steak, and there is enjoyment, and you really enjoy it. And at that point you go, I never have to eat another steak again. I really have never had that experience. I want to go back and enjoy the steak over again. Why? There is some joy in it. There's no denying that. That's what Solomon's saying. There is joy in this. But it doesn't last. It's fleeting. It's there for a moment, but it's gone. And when you do this outside the confines of God and do it for your own personal endeavor, guess what happens? He says there in the verse 11, there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Again, that phrase under the sun is a reference to a world without God. Just in this world, there's nothing to be gained from this. What's the point? What's the purpose? And as Solomon is unfolding this, he's basically doing this in such a way so that we have the same longings that he's writing about. What's the point? What's the purpose? Why are we even here? And again, this is a whole sermon that he's writing, and he's orchestrating this in such a way so that we were able to find God at the end. And that's what he's going to do. Any questions about this? We have about 5 minutes. Yes?
Solomon prayed for wisdom, not wealth, so God gave him both. But physically, actually, where do you think all his wealth came from? What did he do to get all that wealth, to be the wealthiest man in the world that ever lived?
Probably a lot to do with his wisdom. He's a pretty wise individual, so he's probably a very good businessman. But also God promised that to him after. Yeah. So there was a source of God giving that to him. And unfortunately, instead of him giving it credit to God, and we'll get there. He's going to basically say, you work hard, God gives you these things, you can enjoy them, but to give glory to him. And that's what Solomon didn't do. He wanted to do it apart from God and see if he could find satisfaction in them. So,
I suppose a lot of wealth could come from marriages.
Potentially, yeah, trade agreements. Yeah, especially with Egypt to the south. Any other questions? Yeah, no questions. We got to work on the AC in here. It's hot. Is it guys hot?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, maybe if we waited one more day, we wouldn't have to worry about this. It's supposed to be freezing cold tomorrow. So, all right. Well, good. So next week, what we're going to do is this. It's funny. In chapter 1, he talks about wisdom and folly. It says it's vanity. He goes to find joy and satisfaction in things and experiences of the world. That's vanity. Guess what he does? He goes back to wisdom again. Goes a little bit deeper. Says, hey, maybe I missed something. Left the stone unturned. So we're going to look at that again. Again, this whole section at the beginning, he's trying to be autonomous. He's trying to remove God from the picture. Always remember that. That's the point of this book. If we don't remember that, you read that without that perspective, then you look at it and you go, what's going on here? Or is this really in the Bible? All right.